Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 312, Jewish Debt Relief. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today is another episode in which we are looking at the Shemitah year, the year in which we are in the Jewish calendar, the year of release, also known as the sabbatical year. But technically, Shemitah means release. And there are two things that we are invited to be releasing. One is the land from having to serve us. And so in the Bible, at least, the Jews weren't supposed to cultivate the land during this seventh year in the 7-year cycle. And we are also invited to, and of course the Bible uses stronger language than that, release debts that debtors owe to us. The person that we're talking to today who really resonated with that idea of debt release is not a Jewish professional or somebody who has been thinking about Shemitah for many, many years, but is actually a Judaism Unbound listener who was inspired by the idea of Shemitah to go out and launch a debt release project of her own by raising money to buy and then release medical debt. Our guest today, Lisa Grafstein, has launched a campaign called the Shemitah Debt Release Campaign, which is a campaign offered through an organization called RIP Medical Debt. You can find it at ripmedicaldebt.org. You can go to the RIP Medical Debt site and search for the Shemitah Debt Release Campaign. As I said, our guest today, Lisa Grafstein, is not a Jewish professional. She is by day a disability rights lawyer, and by night, and probably also by day and on the weekends, she has also recently become a candidate for the North Carolina House of Representatives. Lisa Grafstein has been named to many lists of the best lawyers in North Carolina and the best lawyers in America. In 2011, North Carolina Super Lawyers named her among the top 50 women lawyers in North Carolina. And the North Carolina Association of Women Attorneys honored her with the Gwyneth B. Davis Award in 2012. She served as the chair of the Labor and Employment Law section of the North Carolina Bar Association, and she was president of the North Carolina Association of Women Attorneys, and also served as a board member for several nonprofit organizations. The last, but hopefully not least, distinction on Lisa Grafstein's bio is that she was recently a student in the class that I taught on leadership and the stories of Moses and the children of Israel in the wilderness in our new Yeshiva Center for Jewish Learning and Unlearning. And so that's a note to mention that you only have about 2 more weeks left to register for our spring semester Yeshiva classes. If you go to unyeshiva.com, that's UNYESHIVA.com. You can see all the classes that are going to be offered this semester. Lex and I are teaching again, as well as 2 fantastic former guests on Judaism Unbound, Kashir Halev Fife and Tova Birnbaum. I should note 2 things. One is that we have what we're calling sneak previews or info sessions or Q&A sessions. They're all coming up this week, and they are going to take place at the time that each class would normally take place. So if you're able to make the info session, you're able to make the class. So you should go to our website and check those out and see if you want to attend a sneak preview session. If so, you should register for that. We'll be excited to see you there, and we're really excited to see you in the classes. So don't wait. Go over to the Yeshiva and register for classes if you are interested in them. And we also want to note that there is financial aid available. We have a sliding scale, what we call do-it-yourself financial aid, and we also have a form if you need financial aid beyond that sliding scale, you can get in touch with us. So we don't want costs to be a barrier to participation in the Yeshiva. So if that is something of interest to you, please check it out and register for classes. So with that, Lisa Grafstein, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
It's great to be with you.
So we've been exploring this topic of the Shemitah here and there for a while now, but usually, I'm trying to think if the other episodes that we've had, it feels like usually people are either talking about the land-oriented elements of Shemitah or some metaphor that flows from there. And there was actually a different element of Shemitah that you got excited about when you heard about it and have launched a campaign based on that. So can you talk a little bit about how you found out about this element of Shemitah, what it is, and then what you decided to do with it?
Sure. Well, I learned about Shemitah on Judaism Unbound in a teaser episode before the Shemitah year began. And having spent a couple of years really delving into Judaism as a part of a conversion journey, I was, I felt offended by the fact that I didn't know what this Shemitah was. So I immediately went and did some research and learned about different aspects of the Shemitah, including the reference to the Shemitah in Deuteronomy and in Nehemiah that related to the release of debts. And the text is not that substantial in and of itself, but there's some articles. Arthur Waskow wrote a piece about toward a Jubilee economy that really delves into some of those economic aspects of the Shemitah and the potential for rejuvenation from the Shemitah and the Jubilee year and how that might play out in current economies. And so that sent me sort of down a road of thinking about the release of debts as opposed to just release of the land. It reminded me of something I had heard not too long before regarding an organization called RIP Medical Debt, which buys up people's medical debt for the sole purpose of forgiving that debt. Two men who founded the organization were involved in the debt collection industry, essentially, or the debt buying industry. So they had a very in-depth knowledge of how that process works and how you can make a huge impact buying up debt at sort of pennies on the dollar. There's a great piece by John Oliver that actually you can access on the RIP Medical Debt site, where he talks about about the oppressiveness of medical debt. And he actually, his staff set up an organization to essentially buy medical debt up and forgive it. It's a very funny piece, and I really recommend it. But the obvious next step from my point of view was to figure out a way to participate in that during the Shemitah year. And the RIP Medical Debt organization has a process by which you can launch an individual campaign, either for your state or under a theme. And so I launched the Shemitah Medical Debt Relief campaign as sort of my effort to mark the Shemitah year beginning right on Rosh Hashanah.
And just to clarify, if I understood that correctly from that site, that anybody who gives $1 to buy up medical debt, they're somehow, because you said pennies on the dollar, they're able to buy $10 worth of medical debt and release it. So every dollar you donate to that is actually relieving basically $10 of debt. Is that right?
Isn't it 100?
It's 100, right?
100.
And there's a lot packed into that, right? So the whole idea, first of all, that medical debt as a concept in American society right now is problematic to begin with. But when you also, understand the process by which a debt of $100 to a hospital or some other medical provider is valued at literally pennies on the dollar or a penny on the dollar by the subsequent organizations that purchase that debt, the sort of intermediary debt buyers. And so over time, once the debt gets sold over and over again, you get to the point where you're buying up debt at literally a penny on the dollar. And so what that really means is that the actual value of that debt to all the players along the line is really very insubstantial on an individual basis, but it's devastating and significant to the people who incur the medical debt.
Before we get too far in, I just want to say, this is so deeply systemically evil. I hate that there is medical debt and at all. But I certainly hate the degree to which it exists in this country and the degree to which it destroys millions of people's lives. And by the way, it destroys people's lives in the sense that it economically destroys people's lives, and it also creates the end of people's lives. It actually destroys, people die. I find it so heinous, and I don't have words for it other than just the strongest negative adjectives like evil and cruel, and I guess oppressive is a little softer, but all of those. So it's pretty important that we find any channel we can to confront this, whether in a Shemitah year or not a Shemitah year. But I'd love to hear more from you about the point A to point B that happened. I mean, you learned about Shemitah relatively recently. We actually spoke last week with folks who also learned about Shemitah pretty recently and channeled it into a project. But what's happening when you learn about Shemitah, learn about these, texts related to debt relief, and then find a place where you can do it? Like, what made you do that? What called you to that project when you could have like been upset and been devastated like so many of us are, but like I didn't go and start an RIP medical debt campaign?
I think there's something basic in all of us that we are born with and that we can nurture or not nurture that leads us to want to do something when we see bad things happen. And, we harden our hearts sometimes. I think that's just how we are, maybe not raised, but trained by society and by the difficulties of the world and the need to, pay the rent and get through the day. So for me, I like projects. To me, this was a response that called for, or an issue that called for response that could be a project. I took it that way as starting something and seeing where it goes, and you all have talked in your show about, there are institutions that are around for decades or years, and then there are projects that maybe can have an impact in the short term. So for me, that was my response to this. And I think sometimes that's an easier thing to do than try to envision a multi-year or long-term organization or solution that you don't really have the capacity to invest in. The impulse to do something, I think, in some ways also comes out of the work that I do. My day job is that I am an attorney and I advocate on behalf of people with disabilities. And there are a lot of bad things that happen in society to people with disabilities. And one of the things that we talk about in my work is when you see something that makes you angry, we can shake our fists at the sky for a while, and then we have to do something. We have to take the next step. And so to me, that's the train of thought or the impulse or the path from feeling a sense of outrage to taking action.
On that note, I was kind of hoping that we together could almost like work through what you've done from first principles, whether or not this was actually how you thought it through. I think it's interesting to sort of think about it because, like you're saying, that there are injustices in society. And of course, the first order move is to say, how can we stop those injustices from happening in the first place? I think this is basically where Lex was going. And it's horrifying and terrible, and it shouldn't happen, and there shouldn't be needy, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't say that glibly. I mean, I think we should be working with everything that we have to make society better. But it often feels to me like there's this element in Judaism, at least aspirationally, that says, okay, but let's take society as it is and ask, what is there that we can do that makes it a little better given how it is? And if some of those things are really hard to do, we don't have to do them every day. We could maybe do it once a week or once a year or once every 7 years. And so it strikes me that as I'm thinking all of this through and I'm thinking like, okay, so the Shemitah comes along and let's just focus on the debt relief element of it. I can imagine, and I would imagine, because this is true of me and I assume it's true of everybody or most people who are listening, that you hear about the Shemitah and they say it's a time to relieve debts. And you're like, I would be thinking like, okay, I'll relieve any debts. Wait a second, nobody owes me any, like I don't hold any debt. So what am I supposed to do? So I guess that's not a part of the Shemitah that I should observe. And actually Lex has made this point about the agricultural dimension of the Shemitah over the, that they just kind of decided, well, that has to do with the land of Israel. So we don't live in the land of Israel. So there's nothing for us to do. So we don't have to observe the Shemitah agriculturally anymore for the last 2,000 years. And on the one hand, you can say, well, there's some sense to that. But on the other hand, it's like, oh, so then this like really interesting Jewish ritual just passes us all by because it doesn't really apply to us, right? Now, I don't know if this is how you were thinking, but now as I sort of make this connection, I'm saying like, okay, well, I don't own any debt. I guess there is a way I could buy debt and then I could forgive it. And that's exactly what John Oliver did on HBO. And I remember being so struck by it, but it didn't occur to me that I should do that.
In reading about and listening to people talk about the Shemitah year and the different ways they're taking an approach to it, there are people who are resting the land. There are people who are letting their gardens and their farms lie fallow. So there's sort of a very basic, concrete way to think about it. Then there's also very far on the other end of the spectrum, metaphorical way to think about release and what that means. And there's a lot in between. So, I kind of think about some of the in-between stuff. To me, the stuff that's sort of at the far end around your individual release, like what do I want to release from my life? That's a way that I see that some people have started approaching the Shemitah year is what do I want to let go of in my life? To me, I think, one of the metaphors really comes from the idea of the Shemitah as the release of control and the idea that, the ways in which we try to control outcomes are the ways in which we can try to control people, through economics or in other ways. I think one of the things that we are talking about and trying to reckon with in society right now is white people, I think, are starting to learn more about the true history of race in our country and the true implications of race in our society. And one of the things that we need to do is to unlearn a lot of what we have been taught about our own history and about our own culture and our own society. And so that unlearning and the release of and letting go of some of that baggage and relearning, I think, is an important sort of metaphorical process. So that's how I've been thinking about Shemitah on a metaphorical as opposed to the concrete level.
You have set as a goal for this campaign $10,000. If it's releasing $100 for every dollar, that means we're releasing $1 million of debt for $10,000. Now, what that means basically is that if there are people out there who think of a gift of $180 or $500 or $1,000 as gifts that they might give in any given year to a charity or philanthropy that they really care about, it's like, well, maybe in the Shemitah year, you could give that amount to something like this and be relieving hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt. Maybe we don't want to do that every year, but you can do that every 7 years. And it's something really powerful that you can do. Like, the power of it is what I'm trying to emphasize. Like, there's the release for ourselves of like giving up control, but there's also the power of releasing for others. It's just something that I'm holding in my head as you're talking. And I'm just curious how you think about that. And I'm also curious whether you know of or could think about with us, like, are there other things like this that might exist in the world that people could come away from this podcast and say, wait, I could do some research on that because maybe there's a way to relieve credit card debt. I don't know.
What you sort of started with reminded me of two sort of disparate things. One is, the throwing open the doors of the Beit Midrash, right? Like where then what happened then was, I'm talking about the episode from the Talmud where Rabban Gamliel has kept the Beit Midrash closed, and then there's the dispute with Rabbi Joshua, and they open up the doors, and then there are whatever it is, 700 or 400 new benches. Now, obviously,
I just want to mention that you were a student in my yeshiva class and we studied this text. So this is a fantastic, amazing remembering of a text, and also an amazing interpretation of it.
Well, I mean, but that's really the whole notion of letting go of control, right? Is that there was a wrestling of control. It was wrestled away once that control was released. The control being the literal unlocking of the door of the Beit Midrash. Then the results from that were exponential, right? And that's really what we're talking about, is sort of an exponential value that's attributed to an action, and that's really what was involved in that story, including, the solving of every problem that came before the students that day. So that's one thing that what you said reminded me of. The other thing it reminded me of is there's a book called Debt, the First 5,000 Years, and it's long. I have not finished it, but there's a paragraph actually I marked out in anticipation of talking to you guys, because it really, to me, was very interesting. And if you don't mind me taking, reading to you from it, is that okay?
We don't mind at all. And also just a note to everybody out there listening, we will put a link to it in the show notes. It's on the website somewhere, this book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years. And it's written also, I would note, by David Graeber, who was deeply Jewishly identified and even incorporates some of that into his book. I don't know if that's the excerpt you're going to be reading where he talks about debt through certain Jewish lenses, but in any case, it's something he does do.
Right. And so not explicitly in this passage, but he's talking about by 2400 BC or BCE, it already appears to have been common practice on the part of local officials or wealthy merchants to advance loans to peasants who were in financial trouble on collateral and to begin to appropriate their possessions. And then he goes on to talk about how that would then, the sort of domino effect of that would be debt peonage, right? Where people would become sort of quasi-slaves until they could pay off their debt, which was never, because of course they'd given up all their possessions. And so he goes on to say, the effects were such that they often threatened to rip society apart. If for any reason there was a bad harvest, large proportions of the peasantry would fall into debt peonage. Families would be broken up. Before long, lands lay abandoned, and indebted farmers fled their homes for fear of repossession and joined semi-nomadic bands on the desert fringes of urban civilizations. Faced with the potential for complete social breakdown, Sumerian and later Babylonian kings periodically announced general amnesties. Such decrees would typically declare all outstanding consumer debt null and void. Commercial debts were not affected. return all land to its original owners, and allow all debt peons to return to their families. Before long, it became more or less a regular habit for the kings to make such a declaration on first assuming power, and many were forced to repeat it periodically over the course of their reigns. So to me, that's a very interesting timing, that 2,400 years BCE is when there seemed to be a very common practice that we might now identify as Shemitah debt release and as the Jubilee of return of the lands. And, to your question, how might else we think about that? Another way we can think about that is democracy. And not to be too political, but, we are in an era where there's lots of discussion about voting rights and access to voting, and that there are individuals and organizations of people who are trying to limit access to voting to maintain control of what should be a democracy. And it's the release of that control has an exponential effect of actually creating the grounds for democracy. So I think there's, that if you want to talk about metaphorical levels, that's a pretty metaphorical level, but in a very real way, I think that's where the empowerment of masses of people and those with power letting go of control really matter. And partly what ties it back to, I think, the question of debt peonages is that was a literal, debts are really now as well as then are not just control of money, but it's control of people. And back to Alexis' point earlier, the effects on people when there's significant debt, it's not just that they owe money and it makes them feel bad. It's that you can't get housing. It's that you can't get loans. It's that there are certain jobs that you can't get. So it magnifies the effects in a negative way. And that's sort of the exponential aspect there. So this notion of resetting, I think, has implications for society at large in our current environment. And, we talk a lot about student loan forgiveness and obviously medical debt forgiveness. There's just so much that if we can get past the notion that somehow this is charity and recognize the idea and the reality that this is about a societal reset that's necessary for a healthy society, to me, that's an important lesson from the Shemitah year, an important roadmap forward, I think.
I think it's hilarious that somebody running for public office said not to be too political. And I also think it's funny that anyone on our show would say that. We're happy for you to be political. We're happy for anybody else to be political. We have preferences around which ways different people might be political on our show, and the ways you're doing it, top notch. But going down that line, not that we're putting the debt pieces behind us, but you are running for the North Carolina House of Representatives. And
True.
That's cool. And the sense I get is part of the story you told about hearing about Shemitah and then going and actualizing that into RIP medical debt. That's not the same thing as like actualizing something through a bill, creating policy, but it's parallel, right? Like you saw a problem and you looked around for ways to address that problem, found one, and enacted something that, look, you're not individually solving medical debt, but if your campaign achieves its full potential, you will have solved $1 million of medical debt, which is a big deal. What's calling you in similar ways to run for office, and how might it help us better understand others who might be called to service?
So I think the two strains are really kind of pulled together by something that Desmond Tutu said. At some point, you have to stop pulling babies out of the river and you have to go upstream to find out why they're falling in the river. Or I think he said people, but I maybe because we're in a Jewish context, I'm thinking about babies floating down a river. But his larger point was, it's great, rescuing is great, but really let's get to the source of the problem. And that to me is maybe a metaphor again for my feeling. I've worked in civil rights. I worked on behalf of people with disabilities and workers, and on behalf of the little guy, I guess, for lack of a better phrase, people who are being harmed by larger systems. And that's valuable work and important work, working to counter bad policies that are enacted at a legislative level. Part of my call to do this is to really go to the source and work on the source. In terms of how that connects Jewishly, I've shared this with Dan, I think, in the Onion Yeshiva class, in our introductions. My father was Jewish, my mother was not Jewish, and we were not raised in any particular religion. And over the years, I've periodically thought about exploring Judaism. I never really went down that road until about 2.5 years ago. I heard something that sort of changed my mindset. I had never really engaged with religion because I thought engaging with religion, quote unquote religion, if that's what we would call Judaism, I thought that it required believing in sort of an anthropomorphized God who's all powerful and all knowing. And that did not strike me as how I view the world. But when I understood that that's not what Judaism requires, I started thinking and reading more. This is around the time that Sarah Hurwitz's book came out. It's called Here All Along. And I know that you all had her on an episode some time back. But that really helped launch me into really exploring Judaism and learning more about it. And honestly, one of the first things I did was go to my podcast app and type in Judaism, and all those 5-star ratings that you guys have been asking for, it really paid off because it popped to the top for me. And I spent, I've listened to 5 years, or I guess 5.5 years now of Judaism Unbound in that time. And I really immersed myself in a lot of the Jewish texts that you all talk about and others, and have joined a synagogue. So I really feel like I'm in a place now where I'm starting to tap into some of the roots that I've not nurtured over the years, and really starting to connect those to the work that I've done. And I will say that, I know that there are a lot of people who consider themselves secular Jews, who consider their Judaism to be doing good works and engaging in civil rights work and that sort of thing. And that's certainly how I felt. Now I feel like it's a little bit more explicit and a little more tied to specific traditions that I'm learning about, and really even now.
It's interesting because I was making a connection in my head as you were talking between your running for office and what I dream of that our listeners would do vis-a-vis Judaism. And I never put it in that category before. I never thought of it as analogous to, a regular person deciding to run for office, because it's kind of the idea that says, like you were saying, that there are these different spheres where I might act in my life. And I think for your average person, they say, well, I see an injustice. I see, for example, poverty. Number one, I'll give to a homeless person, or I may give to a more systemic homeless shelter or something, and it kind of goes from there. And then you say, okay, well, I'm going to vote for certain politicians that represent my values. But it's very rare that somebody kind of says, well, I actually should run for office. I should get into the very center of where these policies are made. And that's just helping me think about, like, that's what I want people to do vis-a-vis Judaism. I think a lot of people look at Judaism and they think it's something that, isn't exactly how I want it, but I can sort of accommodate to it in this way or in that way and make it a little better in my own life. I'll do things a little bit differently at home, et cetera, all of which we're in great favor of. But I want to work through the metaphor here to think about, like, what it looks like when the person says, I'm ready to essentially run for office. And I think that we're trained to think, oh, that means you're going to go to rabbinical school. And I'm looking for a category that is not going to rabbinical school, no offense, Lex, but that says, I want to...
Certainly none taken.
I want to roll up my sleeves and be analogous to somebody running for office. So I'm just curious, like, as somebody who's actually running for office, how does that land on you? How do you see the distinctions and the similarities?
This conversation is also reminding me about Heschel's, books on the prophets, where, a lot of what he's talking about is that these were people who had just an inability to look away from what was happening. Even when times were good, they had an inability to look away when there was any suffering. And so, again, I think that we all have a little piece of that in us, and how that translates in your life, I really think has a lot to do with just your orientation, your history, where you've been, and where you see your strengths. For Lex, strengths played out in going to rabbinical school, and that's a great thing, and he's doing great things with it. I think that it is really an individualized process.
I'm really myself wrestling with the Dan question around, like, what is Jewish running for office that isn't going to rabbinical school? Because as much as I did go to rabbinical school, I agree that we need an answer to that isn't rabbinical school. And your version is actually, like, you're running for office, and elements of Judaism and your relationship to Shemitah are part of that, right? Like, the things you're talking about medical debt are part of your own platform and your own approach that you are running on, right? So I don't know. I'm wondering if just, like, something smaller than going to rabbinical school, like bringing 6 people together at a house to talk about a Jewish thing, or to have to mark a holiday, etc. Like, we've encouraged people to do that since our get-go, right? Like, we want people to do that. I do think there's a way in which that is running for office, right? And what I mean by that is, what do office holders do? What do public officials do? Like, what does their existence in the world create? What's the function? And to me, the function is, I mean, at least in theory, I don't think this actually works a lot of the time. But the idea is that these are like exemplars of people who care deeply about the betterment of, in this case, North Carolina, or in a national case, the United States, whatever. I do think that when Jews go and bring 4 friends together to have a Passover Seder, I do think that person is claiming that they are a person that could be an exemplar of Jewishness, right? Like, this, it is necessary for people to feel I am a real manifestation of Judaism. Like, in order to lead a Passover Seder, you have to think that. Otherwise, you wouldn't feel comfortable. You'd be like, I have to attend somebody else's Passover Seder. And so much of our work has been convincing people, or trying, that they have the permission to do that. And so maybe our project is like handing people the application form to run for a Jewish kind of office. Like, maybe that's what we're doing. Help me think this through, because I'm like stumbling over words, but I feel like there's something here, and I'm curious if you can help us understand it.
I mean, I think it is in some ways, maybe a permission slip is one way to look at it, but there is something about having encouragement and being reinforced. It's a community effort, right? There has to be emotional support. In running for office, they tell you should have a kitchen cabinet of people who you can turn to for advice on specific issues, but also emotional support. Certainly, there are people who were encouraging and supportive, and I think that's particularly true when women run for office, that somebody reaches out and says, hey, you should do this. And that happened for me, and it was critical. And then there have been people who've been supportive and encouraging along the way. So it really is helpful and necessary. I certainly would not have done this had I not been encouraged to do it. But I hesitate to say that, because it always, to me, sounds a little self-deprecating, like I was dragged into this kicking and screaming. I don't want to serve, but I'm going to. So it always has seemed to me a little. It cuts both ways, I guess. But for sure, that's an important piece, is having somebody encourage you.
Yeah, it's funny because as I'm listening to you having this conversation, the two of you, I'm actually feeling a lot of gratitude for you, Lex, because I feel like I'm reflecting on last week's conversation, and one of our guests kept talking about how all he really needed to be able to do something is another person to do it with, or another person to think it wasn't crazy, or something like that. And that hit me at the time, and it's hitting me again, that I feel like even in phrasing some of my questions earlier, I mean, I both admire and do have this desire to push people to say, hey, if you want to see change, you can step forward and make the change happen. Except I also reflect that I'm not really that kind of person. Exactly. I'm that kind of person if I have a partner. And if I don't have a partner, then I'll just sit and think about it. And so Lex, I'm just feeling very grateful that you're that partner for most for most of the last, many years.
Can I shower some more love on Lex?
Okay, this is a lot, and I promise listeners I didn't force this, but yes, Lisa, go for it.
So when I first had this idea for the Shemitah debt relief, I thought, should I do this? This seems a little bit out there. Can I pull it off? And I emailed Lex, because you always say be in touch. So I emailed Lex, and he was super enthusiastic. And I think if he had said, yeah, that sounds like a pretty good idea, I might have just let it drop, because I might have not gotten that reinforcement. But just the significant, encouragement was really important in kind of pushing it over the edge and causing me to act, I guess.
I wanted to ask something that might be a gear shift and might not be, which is your work advocating for people with disabilities. All the things we're talking about, medical debt, right? Like, people with disabilities, for very straightforward reasons, are disproportionately part of the conversation about medical debt, because that's the society we've set up, is one in which if you have a disability, we don't treat that as, oh, you're a person, and so all human beings have the right and basic obligation from society to, like, be treated with respect. We've actually set up a system where like you have to just put down a bunch of money and do all sorts of stuff to achieve what would just basically be a sort of bottom line quality of life for others. But we've also, from a Judaism Unbound place, talked about how frameworks of disability rights advocacy have influenced us. So in one way, we've talked about universal design. I mean, we've talked about how with synagogues and just accessibility, right? We talk about accessibility in literal and metaphorical senses all the time, right? Like we're talking about institutions being able to be accessed, accessibility. And that can be metaphorical in the sense that like, how can we make places inclusive? But it can also be very practical. How can a ramp get a person in a wheelchair into a building? Thinking about how, if we design something that can work for all Jews, including those with disabilities, that actually serves people even who don't have the disabilities. And we've talked about that in other issues. That's one principle we've gained from the disability rights community. I would also add, though we haven't talked about this as much, the slogan that's so powerful of nothing about us without us. The idea that people should not be talking about disabled folks, people with disabilities. I'm using both terms because my understanding is that different individuals prefer different terms. But the idea is that you don't talk about people who have disabilities if they're not themselves able to advocate for themselves in those conversations. So those are two examples. But what are some other examples? How does your work influence your approach, whether it's to medical debt, to Judaism, to anything else?
First of all, I want to go back to your comment about universal design, because that is a very influential concept, I think. There's obviously the physical universal design. And by the way, to promote my state, there's a universal design institute here at North Carolina State University that's very influential and fantastic.
Go Wolfpack.
Right. An issue an idea that I'm trying to sort of flesh out and think about more is when we think about how we develop policies and rules, to infuse that process with this concept of universal design. When we're going to make a rule about something, let's look at it from the point of view of who has the least power in this situation. If it works for that person, then it will work for other people. And so the universal design concept really is, if you build something for somebody who has the least access, or who has the highest level of need for quote unquote adaptation, right? So the world was not built with people with disabilities in mind. That's the sort of phrase. And we try to retrofit things, right? We put a ramp in. We have a bad thing that's happening, and so we try to patchwork over it and make it better. But if we build things, from a universal design perspective from the beginning, it's just going to work better for everybody. So as we're thinking about things like debt release, and by the way, the RIP medical debt folks, they don't talk about forgiveness and they don't talk about charity, they talk about release. And I want to just highlight that, because I think that goes back to this question that they're addressing the fact that this debt comes from a flawed system that was not built appropriately from the beginning, that we have a system of medical care that doesn't take into account people with the highest needs, or who are going to have the highest needs. So I think all those concepts sort of tie together. So to me, universal design and the disability context really is about figuring out how do we recognize the human dignity and start from the point of view of maximizing respect for human dignity. And, there's an obvious Judaism tie in there in terms of viewing every individual as being created in God's image, or the image of whatever you want to call God.
I'm curious, since we're on the topic of universal design, I'm just curious, going back to your story and your journey over the last couple of years, as somebody sort of for whom the Jewish institutions that exist were not designed, right? Or many were not, and I'm curious whether, reflecting on your experience of the last couple of years from the lens of universal design, you have thoughts about kind of what's missing in the on-ramp to Jewish connection for people who may be seeking that, whether they came from some history like you did or from just an interest in Judaism, not necessarily with a pre-existing family history.
I should say, no one has barred me from anything, and I've been welcomed by a synagogue, and I feel good about all that. But what feels alienating, I guess, to some extent, is the ways in which there's not really room made sometimes for the idea that not everybody is part of a Jewish family, right? So much of what is discussed is about the Jewish family context and also having a Jewish history. So much discussion around things like food culture and things that my father actually worked in a kosher deli. So I had some of the food culture, but not really, because my mother was Italian and therefore we ate a lot of pasta. So what I think when people describe themselves as secular Jews or cultural Jews, a lot of those things feel really sort of foreign to me, and I feel kind of alienated in those contexts. People should celebrate their cultures and they should celebrate their heritages in those ways. But I think when that is centered as sort of what Judaism is, it doesn't feel organic to me, and it doesn't really feel comfortable, I guess I would say.
I was on a synagogue website recently, and on their About Us site, they mentioned that we have X number of family units. And then they follow that up with, and we understand families expansively. And it includes singles. And what an incredible thing to say. I include you, a single, as a family. Congratulations, you're included. I see you as a family. Do they think that that's felt as a positive by somebody? That, what that says to me is, it sort of relates to what you just said, right? It reflects to me that they think not being a family, not inhabiting a life that would be quote unquote a family, is so crappy that everybody wants to be called a family. And by the way, I'm saying this not to this one synagogue. Across the board, the term family unit, that's what synagogues talk about. You don't actually talk about how many members you have. You talk about how many family units. And that, I don't know, maybe there's reasons for that are practical and about how many folks are paying member dues. Families tend to pay membership dues together, whatever. But that opens up a whole can of worms. And I bring it up not because I want to talk so much more about families or any of that, but just because we make these assumptions about what we think is sort of the ideal or the good. And then we say to others, congrats, we include you in that definition. It's just like the ramp thing you talked about before, where we built a building that's totally not designed with people with disabilities in mind, and then we throw on these quote-unquote accommodations. That's not a question. That's just my reflection on what you just said. The closing question I have is, I'm going to shout out my chavruta. I have a few study partners, a few chavrutas. One of them is Megan Kallman. She is a state senator here in Rhode Island. And I think of her both because she's a person who I talk to very regularly about Jewish stuff, and because we have done some co-thinking about Shemitah, about the year of release. And what I have learned through that, and just through the flow of our chavruta sessions, we're going through the text of the Amidah, of the daily prayer service. We're not looking at texts that are how do we enact politics in Judaism? We're looking at classic, liturgy. And when I talk to her, it's just so different and candidly so much more exciting. Her default is to apply all of it, every blessing that we're looking at, every word we're looking at, to her life as a politician. And so we end up talking about policy. And so I would call on people who see themselves as deeply wanting to learn about Judaism or whatever, to find a teacher, find a rebbe, find a chavruta who is in politics in one way or another. I think it will serve you. And the other thing I'd say, and this is where I pose my question to you, is having politicians who are deeply thinking through Jewish lenses, I think is good. I'll be honest, I have a lot of questions about this whole framework of the separation of church and state that we have in this country. I think there's lots of good reasons for it. I think it also sets up this line of thinking where we believe, old stuff from religion, that's all private and doesn't tie to public life. There's all sorts of ways in which religions have already and do every day influence politics. What might be gained if more people out there follow your example and blur politics as one realm, Judaism as another? It's not to say that you're running for office to be a spy and only look out for Jewish interests. That's not what I'm saying. But what might we gain if we actually blurred what is constructed as such a duality, church, state? And by the way, I'm saying church on purpose because I'm reminding everyone that we've constructed separation of church and state through one religion, through Christianity's frameworks of what a church is.
I too believe in separation of church and state. I should say that because I should say that. To me, what is to be gained is that there's a moral compass that I think should be part of a religious practice, but also a broader sense of what it means to be a part of a community and have an obligation to other people. So, I think there's an important piece to be gained there. One of the things that I remember thinking when I first started reading about Jewish ethics, this is going back a couple of years. I have a coworker who probably we're not supposed to, but we talk about religion, and she is Christian. And this strong sense that I had that if more people actually engaged with the ideas that are promoted in religious context, that we would just have a better world, which sounds like a trite thing to say. And clearly I'm not the first person to have thought that, but I never really felt it in my bones until I really started actually engaging and thinking about things from kind of a perspective of Jewish ethics. So another callback to one of your previous guests, Douglas Rushkoff, who wrote Nothing Sacred, which was a profoundly influential book on me in terms of thinking about what role Judaism actually plays in just living a life and living a moral and ethical life, and how that dovetails with how we exist in society. And toward the end of the book, not just no spoilers, I suppose, but toward the end of the book, he talks about the idea that what Judaism has to offer the world might eventually one day not be called Judaism, and maybe we just have to be okay with that. That the premises and ideas that undergird Judaism really have a lot to offer the world, and that if we can tap into those could have a profound impact, on our society, and that's maybe a path forward that we don't usually talk about in America.
Thank you so much. There's a lot of seeds you've planted for us to water and flower and grow in future episodes, even though we're not supposed to be putting too much energy into planting things this Shemitah year. So sorry, bad metaphor, but here we are. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you both. This has been great.
And thank you so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. We want to remind you first and foremost, support Lisa Grafstein's amazing Shemitah debt release campaign. You can find it on the RIP Medical Debt website by searching Shemitah, SHMITA. They have a little area where you can search for different campaigns. That will help you find it. You can also find it through our show notes on our website. We've got a direct link to the campaign so that you can support it with a $7 gift. If you want to do 7 for Shemitah, you could do a $49 gift in honor of Jubilee. You could do a $4,900 gift, whatever you are able. That would go a long way. Longer, in fact, than pretty much any other donation, because like we said in this episode, it gets multiplied by a factor of 100. So we hope that you'll do that. And we also hope that in addition to that, you will be in touch with us with any questions, comments, thoughts, etc. that you have for Dan and I. You can do that in all of the following ways. First, there are our Twitter and Instagram and Facebook pages. All of those are at Judaism Unbound. Second, you can go to our website, JudaismUnbound.com. And last but not least, you can always hit us up via email at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. The last request that we will make today is, once again, sign up for those On Yeshiva classes. We've got 4 amazing classes this semester, 12 weeks each. They are going to be jam-packed with fun and with learning and with awesomeness. You can find out more at UNYESHIVA.com, onyeshiva.com. So thank you so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.